I had always heard stories about Aunt Clara. My mom would say she had a fragile mind, and that she preferred to keep to herself in the quiet house she inherited after her husband passed away. I'd never met her until last winter, when my mom invited her to stay with us for a few days. "She's family," Mom said, brushing off my dad's unease. "She just needs a little company. It's been years since she's seen anyone." When Aunt Clara arrived, I couldn't help but stare. She was tall and gaunt, her skin pale and almost translucent. Her eyes darted around the room like she was expecting someone to jump out at her. She smiled, but it didn't reach her eyes. "Hello, dear," she said, her voice soft and shaky. I forced a polite smile. "Hi, Aunt Clara." At first, everything seemed normal, quiet even. Aunt Clara mostly kept to herself, sitting in the corner of the living room, staring out the window. But by the second night, things started to feel off. It began with the whispers. I woke up around 2 a.m. to hear Aunt Clara talking to someone in the hallway outside my room. I cracked the door open to look, but the hall was empty. Aunt Clara's door was slightly ajar, and I could hear her voice inside. "Stop it," she hissed. "I told you to leave me alone." My stomach tightened. Who is she talking to? I leaned closer, carefully not to make a sound. "You're not real," she said, her voice shaking. "I know you're not real." Suddenly, her door creaked open wider, and I jumped back into my room, shutting my door as quietly as I could. I crawled into bed, heart pounding, and tried to convince myself that she'd just been talking in her sleep. The next morning, she seemed fine, cheerful even. She sat at the breakfast table chatting with my mom like nothing had happened. But as the day went on, her mood shifted. She became withdrawn, muttering under her breath and glancing over her shoulder. She wouldn't sit in certain chairs or walk into certain rooms. By the third night, the tension in the house was unbearable. My dad had tried to talk to Mom about sending her home early, but Mom refused. "She's just adjusting," she said. "She'll be fine." That night, I woke up again. This time it wasn't whispers. It was a loud thud, followed by a scraping sound. I grabbed my phone and crept out of bed. The sound was coming from the living room. As I approached, I saw Aunt Clara standing in the middle of the room, holding a kitchen knife. She was staring at the wall, her chest rising and falling rapidly. "Stop watching me," she screamed, slashing the air in front of her. "I know you're there." My blood ran cold. I backed away, my feet barely making a sound on the carpet, but then the floor creaked under me and her head snapped toward me. "Did you see them?" she asked, her voice trembling. I froze. "See who?" Her eyes widened, and she pointed toward the corner of the room. "They're right there," she whispered. "They've been following me for weeks." There was nothing in the corner but shadows. "You don't see them, do you?" she asked, her voice breaking. I shook my head slowly, unsure of what to do. Her expression twisted into something between fear and anger. "They don't like it when people don't believe in them," she said. At that moment, my mom appeared behind me, her face pale. "Clara, give me the knife," she said softly. And Clara's eyes darted between us. "You brought them here," she said accusingly. "No one brought anything here," Mom said gently. "Let's go to bed, okay?" Aunt Clara hesitated, then dropped the knife onto the floor. She collapsed into the nearest chair, burying her face in her hands. That was the last night she stayed with us. The next morning, my mom made arrangements to have her taken back to her home, along with a doctor's visit. But even after she left, I couldn't shake the feeling that something lingered. Sometimes late at night, I hear faint whispers in the house, too quiet to make out, but just loud enough to remind me of Aunt Clara's voice. And sometimes when I look into the corner of a room, I feel like something is watching me from the shadows.
When my parents suggested we visit Uncle Ray's house for the weekend, I was not thrilled. Uncle Ray was an odd man, always quiet and distant at family gatherings. He lived alone in a creaky old colonial house in the Germantown neighborhood of Philadelphia. My mom said he needed company, but something about him and that house always made me uneasy. We arrived late Friday evening. The house was just as I remembered it. Tall, narrow windows, weathered gray siding, and an air of abandonment despite its occupant. The dim porch light barely illuminated the stoop, casting long shadows over the cracked stone steps. Uncle Ray opened the door and greeted us with his usual politeness, though he seemed more withdrawn than ever. His hands trembled slightly, and he avoided meeting my eyes. Come in, he said, stepping aside. The house smelled musty, like old books and damp wood, with a faint metallic tang I couldn't place. The wooden floors groaned under our weight, and the faded wallpaper was peeling in places. I noticed right away that one door upstairs at the end of the hall was padlocked. "What's in there?" I asked without thinking. Uncle Ray's expression changed instantly. His face tightened and his eyes darted to the floor. "Storage," he said quickly. "Just old junk I haven't gotten around to sorting yet. Nothing worth looking at." The way he said it made my skin prickle. That night, I slept in a small guest room on the second floor. The bed was this, the blankets were scratchy, and the house was way too quiet. Around midnight, I woke up to a sound, a soft creak like footsteps on the old wood. I sat up in bed, my pulse quickening. The sound came again, louder this time, and it was coming from the hallway. I got up, opened my door a crack, and peeked out. The hallway was dim, lit faintly by the moonlight filtering through a window at the far end. The padlocked door seemed darker than the rest of the house, its heavy lock catching the faint light. Then I saw it. The faintest flicker of light from underneath the door. I held my breath, straining to listen. My heart thudded in my chest as I stepped closer. Just as I reached the door, I heard something, a low noise like a whisper, though I couldn't make out the words. "Uncle Ray?" I whispered, my voice barely audible. The whispering stopped. A chill ran down my spine, and I turned to go back to my room, but as I did, I heard the faintest clink. The padlock had moved. I didn't look back. I ran to my bed and pulled the covers over my head, lying awake until morning. At breakfast, I told my parents what I'd heard. My mom laughed it off. "It's an old house," she said. "Houses like this make noises. You probably just dreamed it." Uncle Ray didn't say a word. He He stared at his plate, his hands shaking slightly as he cut his toast. I couldn't stop thinking about that door. That afternoon, while my parents were outside in the garden, I went back upstairs. I stood in front of the padlocked door, debating with myself. Curiosity won. I went downstairs to Uncle Ray's study and rummaged through his desk drawers. Sure enough, I found a small keyring. My hands were shaking as I brought it back upstairs. The second key fit. The padlock clicked open. I pushed the door open slowly. The room was dim, lit only by a small window, streaked with dirt. The smell hit me first, a mix of mildew, damp wood, and something else, like spoiled meat. The room was nearly empty except for an old trunk in the corner. It was large, battered, and covered in scratches with a thick leather strap securing it shut. I took a step closer. My stomach churned as I noticed something else. Dark stains on the floor near the trunk. Faint, but unmistakable. I didn't dare open it. My mind raced with possibilities, none of them good. Suddenly, a voice behind me made me jump. "What are you doing?" I spun around to find Uncle Ray standing in the doorway. His face was pale, his expression a mix of anger and fear. I was just curious," I stammered. "You shouldn't be in here," he said, stepping forward and grabbing my arm. His grip was tighter than I expected. "This room is off limits. Do you understand?" "What's in the trunk?" I demanded, pulling away from him. He didn't answer. Instead, he shoved the door shut and locked it again. "Stay out of it," he said through clenched teeth. "Some things are better left alone." The rest of the day was awkward. Uncle Ray barely spoke, and I avoided being alone with him. That night, as I lay in bed, I couldn't stop thinking about the stains, the smell, and the trunk. Around 1 a.m., I heard a noise. This time, it wasn't footsteps or creaking wood. It was dragging sound, like something heavy being pulled across the floor. I opened my door and peeked out. The padlocked door was slightly ajar, and the hallway smelled faintly of decay. I didn't go any closer. Instead, I locked my door and stayed awake until morning. The next day, we left early. Uncle Ray didn't try to stop us, but as we drove away, I saw him standing in the upstairs window, watching us leave. A few weeks later, we got a call from the police. Uncle Ray was missing. When they searched the house, they found the room empty. No trunk, no stains, nothing. To this day, I don't know what was in that room or what Uncle Ray had been hiding. But sometimes, late at night, I think about that dragging sound, and I wonder if whatever was in the trunk got out.
I hadn't seen my grandparents in years. They lived in an old farmhouse on the outskirts of a small town, far enough away that visits were rare. When my mom suggested we spend the weekend there to help them out with some chores, I hesitated. I remembered their house being cold and a little unsettling, but I couldn't say no. The house looked almost the same as it had when I was a kid. Weathered wood siding, a sagging porch, and those faded curtains in the windows that seemed like they were always drawn. Grandma and Grandpa greeted us warmly, but something felt off. They both looked thinner, more frail, and tired. "I'm so glad you're here," Grandma said as she hugged me. "The house has been giving us trouble." "What kind of trouble?" my mom asked. "Oh, just some odd smells coming from the walls," Grandma said, waving it off. "It's probably mice. Your father was going to take care of it, but he's been so busy in the fields." Grandpa nodded, but didn't say much. He seemed distracted, constantly glancing toward the hallway that led to the back of the house. That night, I stayed in the guest room at the far end of the hall. The air in the room was heavy, and there was a faint sour smell I couldn't quite place. I thought it might be mold. The wallpaper was peeling in places, revealing discolored patches of wood beneath. I woke up around 2 a.m. to a scratching sound. It was faint, like tiny claws on wood, coming from inside the wall near my bed. "Mice?" I told myself, trying to calm down. "It's just mice." But as I lay there, the sound got louder. It wasn't just scratching. It was accompanied by soft, rhythmic thuds, like something was knocking from within the wall. The next morning, I mentioned it at breakfast. "Probably squirrels," Grandpa said, not looking up from his plate. "They get into the walls sometimes." Grandma didn't say anything, but I noticed her hand trembling slightly as she sipped her coffee. That afternoon, my mom and I helped clean out the attic. It was filled with old boxes, yellowed newspapers, and forgotten furniture. The air up there was worse, stale and sour, with that same faint smell from my room. "Do you smell that?" I asked my mom. She nodded. "Probably dead mice," she said, wrinkling her nose. "We'll tell your grandparents to call an exterminator." As we sorted through a pile of boxes, I noticed a large, square patch in the floor that didn't match the rest of the boards. It looked newer, like it had been replaced recently. "Did Grandpa fix this?" I asked, pointing it out. My mom shrugged. "I don't know. Maybe something broke." That night, the scratching and knocking in the walls returned. This time it was louder, more frantic, and seemed to move from one part of the wall to another. I couldn't take it anymore. I got out of bed and followed the sound down the hallway. It led to a door at the far end, the door to the basement. I hesitated. The basement had always freaked me out as a kid. It was dark, damp, and full of shadows, but I couldn't ignore the noise. I opened the door and flipped the switch. The single bulb at the bottom of the stairs flickered weakly. The smell hit me immediately, stronger now, sour and almost metallic. I crept down the steps, my hand trailing along the cold, damp wall. The basement was cluttered with tools, old furniture, and shelves of dusty jars. But in the corner, I saw something that made my stomach drop. There was a section of the wall that had been patched up, the wood newer than the rest, and from behind it, the knocking sound continued. I stood frozen, staring at the wall, when a hand clamped down on my shoulder. I screamed, spinning around to see Grandpa standing behind me, his face pale and his eyes wide. "What are you doing down here?" he snapped, his voice sharper than I've ever heard. I heard the noise," I stammered. "It's coming from the wall." Grandpa's expression softened, and he sighed heavily. "Oh, you shouldn't have come down here," he said quietly. "Go back to bed." I hesitated, but his tone left no room for an argument. next morning, my mom announced we were leaving early. She didn't explain why, and I didn't ask. As we packed up, I noticed Grandma watching us from the porch, her face unreadable. On the drive home, I couldn't shake the image of that patched-up wall in the basement. "Mom," I finally said, "did you hear the noises in the walls?" She glanced at me, her knuckles white on the steering wheel. "Let's not talk about it," she said. Months later, I overheard my mom on the phone. She was whispering, but I caught bits of the conversation. Human remains. Behind the walls. Police said it was old. No charges. Mental decline. I never asked her about it, and we never went back to the farmhouse. But sometimes, when I lie awake at night, I can still hear the faint sound of scratching and knocking, and I wonder what, or who, have been inside those walls.